Racist cop sentenced to life in prison for pointing a gun at a military general during a funeral. The morning sun filtered gently through a pale sky as the flags fluttered at half-mast. Rows of white headstones stretched across the quiet military cemetery like silent witnesses to generations of service. The grass was cut to precision. The air carried the scent of fresh earth and solemn pride. Folding chairs had been arranged beneath a white canopy, where grieving officers in dress uniforms and civilians in black gathered to honor a man whose legacy stretched far beyond the battlefield. General Walter Davis Sr. had passed away at the age of 78. He wasn't just another decorated officer. He was a living symbol of what was possible in a country that had once denied him a seat at the table. He had been the first black general to command a fully integrated division. He'd earned the nation's highest honors. But more importantly, he had earned the unwavering respect of his soldiers, black, white, and otherwise. Among the mourners were several generals, both active and retired, along with senators, local leaders, and a large contingent of the Davis family. News cameras were kept at a distance, out of sight but ever present. On this day, the world was watching. From the back of the assembly, a tall figure in a sharply pressed army dress uniform stepped forward. His face was familiar to many, not from television or campaign ads, but from battlefield reports and military briefings. Walter Davis Jr., the son of the deceased, stood straight and calm as he approached the podium. A general in his own right, he carried himself not just with rank, but with the gravity of grief and purpose. He cleared his throat, his voice steady but edged with emotion. My father didn't believe in easy victories. He believed in honor, in integrity, in showing up when it's hard, and leading when it's darkest. He taught me that serving this country meant holding it accountable to its highest ideals. As the crowd hung on his every word, a rustling stirred behind them, faint at first, but building. A police cruiser parked along the perimeter, and out stepped a man in blue. Sergeant Travis Milton adjusted his belt as he approached the gathering. He was assigned to perimeter security. Nothing more. Yet the moment his eyes landed on the uniformed black man at the podium, something shifted behind his gaze. He narrowed his eyes, then scanned the audience, as if searching for a break in the illusion. To him, this didn't look right. A black man in command. Another in uniform. Too many of them. Too decorated. Too confident. Milton stepped closer, hand brushing against the holster at his side. A few mourners turned to glance at him. His presence wasn't needed up front. And his pacing felt wrong. Then it happened, quick as a spark. In a single, jarring motion, Milton unlatched his holster, drew his firearm, and charged forward. His voice cracked like a whip over the quiet crowd. Step away from the podium. Hands where I can see them. You're impersonating a federal officer. Gasps erupted. Someone screamed. Chairs clattered as people jumped to their feet. A woman dropped the folded flag she had been clutching to her chest. General Davis Jr. didn't move. He didn't flinch. He stood at the podium, eyes locked on the barrel of the gun now aimed directly at his chest. Around him, chaos built like a storm. But he was a soldier. This was not the first time a weapon had been pointed at him. What made this moment different was where he stood, on American soil. At his father's funeral, surrounded by his own countrymen. He spoke calmly, evenly. Sergeant, lower your weapon. That is an order. But Milton's hand shook, finger twitching on the trigger. You're lying. I don't care who you think you are. This ends now. From the side, a young Army private who had served under Davis Jr. pulled out his phone and started recording. The camera was steady, and the frame caught everything: the trembling gun, the cold fury in Milton's face, and the unshakable composure of a man born to lead under fire. Behind them, other officers moved in, slowly, hands raised, trying not to escalate. The cemetery had turned into a standoff. Honor guards froze in their places. A child clung to his mother's waist, too frightened to cry. Still, Davis Jr. didn't move. His voice dropped, quieter now, but even more powerful. My name is General Walter Davis Jr., United States Army. You are pointing a loaded weapon at an officer of the armed forces, in front of hundreds of witnesses. At a military funeral. Stand down now, or you will face consequences that no badge can protect you from. Something cracked in Milton's face, whether it was disbelief, panic, or rage, no one could tell. But in that flickering moment of hesitation, two uniformed officers moved in from the side and disarmed him. The gun fell to the grass. Milton was shoved to the ground, screaming about orders, and fakes, and frauds. His voice growing more incoherent with every passing second. Silence returned slowly, like breath held too long. Davis Jr. looked down at the weapon on the ground. Then he looked at the trembling man in cuffs. No hate in his eyes. Only the weary knowledge that for some people, no rank, no title, no achievement could ever strip away the color of your skin in their judgment. He turned back to the podium and picked up the speech where he had left off. As I was saying, my father believed in this country, even when it didn't believe in him. And he taught me to love it anyway. The applause that followed wasn't loud, it wasn't meant to be. It was slow, soft, but it carried more weight than any explosion. The cameras caught everything. And across the nation, the reckoning had only just begun. The video spread across the internet like wildfire. It started with a single post, just a clip, 52 seconds long, shared by the young private who had stood in quiet horror at the funeral. Within an hour, it was everywhere. By lunchtime, it was on every news channel. By nightfall, it had gone global. Racist cop points gun at U.S. general during father's funeral. The headline sat above the footage. Raw and undeniable. There was no editing, no spin, no room for context. It was all there. The trembling hand on the trigger. The uniformed man standing tall. The panicked crowd. The quiet authority in the general's voice. Twitter exploded. Hashtags flooded the feed. Hashtag justice for General Davis. Hashtag this is America. Hashtag disarm hate. On TikTok, reactions poured in from veterans. From civil rights activists. From teenagers who had never even heard of Walter Davis Jr. until that moment. On cable news, the story dominated every panel. The audacity of pointing a weapon at a decorated general. And at a funeral, no less. Local officials scrambled. The mayor of the small town where the cemetery was located held a rushed press conference. Flanked by two uncomfortable police spokespeople, she read from a carefully worded statement. There was an unfortunate misunderstanding during a high-profile funeral today. A responding officer, Sergeant Travis Milton, believed there was a security threat and acted according to his training. No shots were fired. Thankfully, no one was injured. The press didn't buy it. Neither did the public. Within hours, reporters uncovered more than the city wanted them to see. Sergeant Milton wasn't just a lone officer who made a mistake. He had a file, a thick one. 4 internal complaints of racial profiling, 2 suspensions, 1 for using excessive force during a traffic stop involving a black teenager, and another for threatening language during a protest. Somehow, he'd kept his badge. Now, that history was national news. Davis Jr., true to his nature, did not seek out cameras. He turned down interview requests from CNN, NBC, and even 60 Minutes, but behind closed doors. He filed a formal complaint with the Department of Defense and the Department of Justice. His tone was professional, his message, unflinching. The United States military cannot remain silent when its officers are threatened. Not by foreign enemies, but by those sworn to protect us at home. The pressure built quickly. Civil rights organizations called for immediate action. Protests formed outside the city police department. Veterans groups, diverse and disciplined, issued joint statements of solidarity. We stand with General Davis. Uniform is not a color. But inside the Davis household, the mood was far from triumphant. Threats started arriving within days. Anonymous calls in the middle of the night. Letters slipped into the mailbox, scrawled with racial slurs. Laced with venom. You're not a hero. You're a fraud. You'll be dealt with. Walter Jr.'s wife, Denise, kept their children away from the news. She stopped answering the door. The youngest, Caleb, asked why the police were driving by their house every night now. Walter didn't have an answer that would make sense to a child. The police department, meanwhile, began circling the wagons. A few senior officers made statements defending Milton, not his actions, but his intentions. They claimed he had poor visibility, that he was overwhelmed, that he didn't recognize the dress uniform, that maybe the sun had been in his eyes. He saw someone he didn't recognize, in a uniform he couldn't confirm, at a high-alert location, said the police union spokesperson. This wasn't racism, it was protocol. But no one believed that. Because they had seen the look in Milton's eyes. Not fear, not confusion, disgust. Then, a name surfaced in a thread on Reddit, of all places. Officer Karen Blake. She had worked with Milton for nearly 7 years before transferring to a neighboring district. Her personnel file was clean. Her record, respected, and in an anonymous post, later confirmed to be hers, she said she had seen this coming a long time ago. He hated seeing black men in positions of power. Especially in uniform. He used to say things like, "They're ruining the badge," and "affirmative action officers don't belong out here." We reported him. Nothing ever happened. The post went viral. A day later, Blake made the decision that would change everything. She walked into the local news station in uniform, sat down, and gave a live interview. "I'm here because silence is complicity," she said, "and I won't be complicit anymore." She recounted the incidents that Internal Affairs had buried. How Milton had stopped black off-duty officers in plainclothes, demanding ID while letting white ones pass. How he referred to the civil rights protests as "chimp parades" in the locker room. How he once asked if General Colin Powell was really a soldier or just a political mascot. The anchor asked why she hadn't spoken up sooner. Blake looked into the camera. "Because I was afraid of losing my job. But now, I'm more afraid of what happens if no one speaks at all." Her testimony broke the case wide open. More officers stepped forward, black, white, Latino, each with a story, each with a moment they'd stayed silent. One described how Milton had once bragged that he'd put down a suspect who looked like he was about to get uppity. Another recalled Milton sneering at a photo of a black female captain, saying, "We're giving stripes to secretaries now?" The department could no longer pretend this was a misunderstanding. An independent prosecutor was appointed. Federal investigators took over, and the phrase, "hate crime under color of law," began appearing in headlines. But amidst all of it, Davis Jr. never made himself the center of the storm. He remained focused on his soldiers, on his duties, and on his father's legacy. "I'm not looking for revenge," he told the DOJ in a closed-door interview. "I'm looking for justice. For my family. For every soldier who ever wondered if the uniform would be enough to protect them at home." The tide was shifting. And for the first time in his career, Sergeant Travis Milton found himself behind bars, not just as a suspect, but as a symbol of a system no longer able to protect those who had abused their power for far too long. But the reckoning had only just begun. The FBI didn't want to take the case at first. But public pressure turned silence into surrender. With every headline, with every protest sign outside the Department of Justice building reading, "A general deserves justice," there was no longer room to maneuver quietly behind the curtain. Under the authority of a Civil Rights Division mandate, a federal investigation was launched. The video footage became Exhibit A, scrutinized frame by frame. Analysts enhanced the audio, filtered the chaos, and timed every second of Sergeant Travis Milton's actions. There was no stumble. No ambiguity, no hesitation. He had drawn his gun deliberately. He had shouted, "Imposter." He had taken aim, not out of fear, but with certainty. They pulled the logs. They reviewed radio transmissions. They spoke with the soldiers standing nearby, with the funeral coordinators, with the honor guard and even the groundskeepers. Every account aligned. The man Milton had pointed a gun at was not an unknown threat in camouflage. He was a United States Army general, speaking at his father's funeral. It should have ended there. But it didn't. With a court order, the FBI gained access to Milton's phone. That's when things unraveled. Inside his encrypted chat apps were dozens of messages, some jokes, some rants, some screenshots of what he called woke garbage. Others were memes, doctored images of black soldiers and coffins, captions laced with racial slurs. One thread referred to a black colonel as another diversity trophy in uniform. Another, more chilling, "We used to fight our enemies overseas. Now they're saluting flags on our streets." But it wasn't just private texts. They traced his online activity. Deep in the back end of a forum known as White Shield. A digital echo chamber for radical white supremacists masquerading as traditionalists. They found a familiar username, TrueBadge77. Cross-referencing IP addresses confirmed what investigators feared. Milton had been an active participant in the group for over 4 years. He had commented on recruitment strategies, He had praised posts celebrating silent resistance from within. He had shared stories of police interactions, masking them as small victories. The smoking gun wasn't his words. It was a photo he had posted months prior, a snapshot of his locker, where a patch with the white shield insignia sat just above a thin blue line sticker. A badge of hate, worn behind the badge of law. Back in the city, officials scrambled again, this time not to defend Milton, but to distance themselves. But the past had a way of clawing back. As investigators dug deeper, they unearthed a web of internal complaints long buried by bureaucracy. Officers had filed reports, voicing concern over Milton's language and behavior. None had gone beyond internal counseling. In one complaint, an African-American officer described Milton mocking his promotion. Another involved a complaint from a black teenager who said Milton forced him to kneel during a traffic stop, shouting, "Kneel like your people used to." None of it had ever reached public records, because it had all been quietly settled or dismissed. A leaked memo from the precinct's Internal Affairs Office confirmed suspicions. Milton is a risk of PR damage. Keep supervised but do not escalate. That memo was 3 years old. The public outcry surged anew. Cable news invited legal experts. Town hall meetings turned into fiery forums. Civil rights groups demanded resignations. But it was the veterans who spoke with a weight no one could ignore. The National Black Veterans Coalition released a statement that struck at the heart of the matter. This wasn't just a gun pointed at one man. It was aimed at our pride, our service, our sacrifice. A bullet was not fired, but a wound was made. One that echoes through every black soldier who ever wondered if his stripes were seen as real. When the statement aired on national television, the silence was deafening. Not even the most cynical pundits could spin it. And through it all, Walter Davis Jr. remained composed, publicly silent, yet privately preparing for something greater. He had stayed away from the cameras. He had turned down exclusive interviews. But as the evidence mounted, as the lies collapsed, and as the nation held its breath, he made a decision. He would testify, not in private, not in some sealed deposition. He would speak, in uniform, before the military tribunal and a civilian federal court. He would give voice to every man and woman who had bled for a country that sometimes forgot their faces. The courtroom was packed. Uniformed service members, civilians, journalists, and families who had worn the pain of injustice for generations. Cameras were forbidden, but no one in that room would forget what they saw. Walter walked in straight-backed, decorated, composed. He raised his right hand, swore to tell the truth, and then told it with precision, clarity, and fire. "I did not expect a gun at my father's funeral," he said, voice steady, "but I have been staring down barrels since I was 12. I have been stopped, questioned, doubted, while wearing this uniform. Some see medals, others see melanin." He paused, looked directly at Milton, now seated behind his defense team, eyes lowered. "You did not see a general. You saw a threat. You didn't ask for ID. You didn't radio for backup. You made a decision based not on protocol, but prejudice. That is not policing. That is hate." The room was silent. Walter continued, "My father survived Vietnam, Desert Storm, and a segregated boot camp. He was buried with honor. And still, even in death, he could not be safe from the thing he fought his whole life." He ended with words that would be replayed for weeks in every corner of the internet. Transcribed onto posters, etched into speeches. "I do not want revenge. I want this country to stop mistaking our silence for surrender." It was no longer just a court case. It was a reckoning. The courthouse stood like a fortress under siege, ringed with reporters. Veterans in uniform, civil rights groups, and silent protesters holding portraits of General Walter Davis Sr. The world was watching. Live feeds from every major news outlet streamed the proceedings to millions of screens. For once, America had paused for justice. Inside the courtroom, Sergeant Travis Milton sat flanked by his defense team, his badge removed, his expression unreadable. The prosecution sat composed but fierce. Their tables stacked with witness folders, video footage, forensic reports, and digital forensics that felt more like war evidence than courtroom files. Opening statements began. The prosecutor laid out the timeline, the facts, the footage. They called it a deliberate act rooted not in fear, but in prejudice, and promised the jury would see the truth. Unfiltered, Milton's lead defense attorney, a polished man with a polished tone, opened with a different angle. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "our client made a mistake, but not a crime. He saw something that triggered concern. He reacted, under stress, as he was trained to. They called it reasonable fear. They called it an unfortunate misreading of protocol. But it wasn't fear on trial, it was a pattern." Witness after witness took the stand. A funeral attendee, trembling, recounted how Milton's gun was already halfway up before he said a word. He didn't hesitate. He wasn't confused. He was angry. The video was played again, this time frame by frame. Milton's expression, the stiffness in his posture, the fact that he ignored 3 other officers who tried to intervene. The courtroom grew still. Then came the internal affairs files, records that the precinct once fought to keep buried. The disciplinary warnings, the ignored complaints, the quiet, counseling sessions that amounted to little more than slaps on the wrist. But perhaps no moment hit harder than when Davis Jr. returned to the stand. Dressed in full uniform once again, he spoke not just as a son or a general, but as a soldier wounded in a different kind of war. "If my father could rise from that grave," he said, voice resonant and clear, he would ask one question. "Why does this uniform provoke bullets instead of salute?" He didn't raise his voice. He didn't point fingers, but the air changed. Something deep shifted in the jurors' eyes. "I've led men in battle. I've buried friends who wore this flag. And I've never feared for my life in uniform, until the day I buried my father." He paused. "And I feared not because of an enemy overseas, but because of a man trained to protect me, whose only crime I committed was existing in a skin he could not respect." The courtroom held its breath. Then came the cross-examination. Milton's attorney tried to twist the testimony. "General Davis, you didn't identify yourself right away, did you?" "I was delivering a eulogy," Walter replied. "Do you normally ask grieving families to show ID while speaking?" The defense tried another angle. "Did you look aggressive? Were your gestures unusual?" Walter didn't flinch. "If I were a white general, would we be having this conversation?" No answer. And then came Officer Karen Blake. She walked in with purpose. A former colleague who had nothing to gain, but everything to lose. Under oath, she revealed what few dared to say aloud. That Milton had long held contempt for black officers. That he joked about affirmative action ranks, and once referred to a black commander as just a janitor with stars. Her voice didn't shake. "I didn't report him at first," she admitted. "I thought it would go away. I thought maybe I was overreacting. But when he pointed that gun at General Davis, I realized silence was complicity." The defense tried to discredit her. They brought up minor disciplinary marks from years prior. But Karen didn't buckle. "He told me," she added, looking directly at Milton, "that someday there'd be a reckoning. And people like him would take back their country, one trigger at a time." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The prosecution rested. Milton chose to testify. It was a calculated risk, and one that backfired. He insisted he didn't recognize the uniform, that Davis Jr. looked suspicious, and that his movements were abrupt. The prosecutor countered, "So, your training tells you that a decorated general, in full uniform, giving a eulogy at a funeral surrounded by Secret Service and military security, looked like a threat?" Milton hesitated. "I didn't know who he was." "You didn't care who he was." Silence. The final words from the prosecution were quiet, but searing. "Fear is human. Prejudice is learned. But when prejudice pulls a trigger, even metaphorically, it's a threat to the very foundation of justice." The judge gave the jury their instructions. They left the room, and the world waited. Outside, the crowd grew. 2 hours later, the bailiff called for silence. The jury had reached a verdict. 12 jurors filed in. The foreman stood. "In the case of the United States versus Sergeant Travis Milton, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty on all counts. Count 1. Assault with a deadly weapon against a federal officer. Count 2. Racially motivated conspiracy to commit violence. Count 3. Willful endangerment of a decorated military officer in active duty." In total, the charges carried a sentence that could last longer than a lifetime. Milton slumped, eyes wide, the reality of consequence finally catching up. He would no longer wear a badge. He would no longer carry a gun. He would spend the rest of his life in a cell, while the world outside changed. Just a little, because someone finally answered a long unspoken question with something stronger than fear: truth. The courtroom was silent, so silent. It made the sound of the judge's robes brushing the bench seem thunderous. Everyone was there: the press, the families, the veterans, the strangers who felt, somehow, that this case belonged to them, too. Sergeant Travis Milton sat shackled, his uniform replaced by a plain tan jumpsuit. His lawyer stood beside him, stoic but defeated. The verdict had been delivered. Now came the sentence. The judge, an aging man with clear eyes and a voice like stone over water, looked out across the room. "Mr. Milton," he began, "you swore an oath to protect and serve without prejudice, without fear, without favor. You betrayed that oath not once, but repeatedly, in ways your own department ignored. But this time, your actions were caught. This time, your target wore a uniform that our nation still, despite everything, respects." He paused, letting that weight settle. "This court sentences you to life in federal prison, without the possibility of parole. Your actions were not just reckless, they were willful, fueled by hate, and executed at a moment meant for mourning." A gasp came from the back of the courtroom. Some cried quietly, others held each other, a few clapped, but were quickly hushed by court officers. The judge added one more thing, softly: "This is not a victory. It's a reckoning." As the gavel fell, the world beyond the courtroom exploded into noise. Blank. Blank. Outside, media vans hummed, hashtags exploded, cable news anchors called it historic, divisive, long overdue. Social media fed on the moment like wildfire. In conservative circles, outrage brewed fast and loud. Unfair, some cried. He was doing his job. Others accused the judge of political theater. A few radio personalities called Milton a scapegoat for the race war the left wants. But in the heart of the city, in churches, community centers, and the homes of veterans, there was something different. A quiet, tearful sense of justice, something not triumphant, but necessary. Outside the courthouse, a group of black veterans embraced. One of them, a Vietnam-era officer missing 2 fingers, wept openly. "I waited 50 years to see the uniform respected like that," he said. Cameras surrounded General Walter Davis Jr. as he stepped down the marble steps of the courthouse. He didn't flinch under the flashing lights. He didn't smile. He wasn't there to celebrate. He stepped up to the podium, surrounded by fellow service members. "I am not here today with joy," he said, voice firm but exhausted. "I take no pleasure in seeing another man caged. I didn't file my complaint for revenge. I did it so that no one, no soldier, no son, would ever have to stand at his father's grave, wondering if he'll leave alive." He scanned the crowd. "You can call this a win for justice, or you can call it a loss for the nation. I only ask this: that we stop letting fear dress itself as authority. That we stop letting skin color rewrite loyalty." And then he left. No interviews, no press circuit. He simply vanished into a black SUV. The windows tinted, the motor quiet. Blank. Meanwhile, in prison, Sergeant Travis Milton found out what isolation really meant. At first, he thought he would be treated like a martyr. The guards who booked him barely spoke. The white supremacists he had once joked with online had moved on to louder, younger voices. No welcome, no letters, no rallies outside his cell block. His wife stopped visiting after 3 months. His children, embarrassed and bullied, changed their last name. He received a few letters, angry, threatening ones, from those who thought he hadn't done enough. A few more from people pretending to care. But the silence, over time, was heavier than the noise. At night, in the stale light of a federal penitentiary, Milton began to replay it all. The funeral, the moment he raised the gun, the look in Davis Jr.'s eyes, not afraid, not angry, just disappointed, like a teacher looking at a student who never learned. In the yard, no one wanted to sit with him. Not the skinheads, not the officers turned inmates. He was toxic. He was the man who pointed a gun at a general at a funeral and got caught. The worst kind of failure, both in hate and in execution. And something began to shift. In those long hours, Milton started reading the reports again. The files from the trial. The transcripts. At first to find something he could fight, some legal loophole. But slowly, as the days turned to months, something else began to settle in. He had done it. No misunderstanding. No protocol error. He had hated that uniform. He had hated the man inside it. And he had let that hate make decisions for him. Blank. Underscore. Blank. One night, alone in his cell, he wrote a letter. It wasn't an apology. It was a question. Why didn't you shoot back? He asked. He sent it to Davis Jr., never expecting a reply. 2 weeks later, a single sentence came back. Because my father taught me to be stronger than the people who fear me. That was all. But for the first time, Milton sat in the quiet and wept. Not because he was sorry. Not because he wanted forgiveness. But because he realized something had always been wrong, and it had always been inside him. And no amount of badges, guns, or false authority could cover it up now. Blank. Underscore. Blank. Across the country, the story faded. Another news cycle. Another crisis. Another face. But something remained. At West Point, cadets studied the case during ethics training. In classrooms, students debated the meaning of justice. In neighborhoods where uniforms once only meant danger, little boys began to salute again when they saw one walking by. And at a small cemetery in Georgia, the grave of General Walter Davis Sr. was visited more often now, by strangers. Veterans, and young officers who brought their children along. One left a note that read, "Sir, we're still fighting, but now we know who we're fighting for." The wind was soft that morning, like a whisper from the past. Walter Davis Jr. stood beneath the bright spring sky, his military uniform pressed and spotless, the medals on his chest glinting faintly in the Georgia sun. Around him, rows of white gravestones stretched out like silent witnesses, holding the weight of forgotten sacrifices. The military cemetery, usually quiet, was alive today with movement, color, and something deeper, purpose. It had been exactly 1 year. 1 year since the gun had been raised. 1 year since his father's funeral was nearly turned into a battlefield. And now, Walter Davis Jr. was back, not as a grieving son, but as the host of something far greater. A ceremony, a reckoning, a tribute. Veterans, black, white, Latino, Asian, stood in rows. Some wore full-dress uniforms. Others simple jackets with service patches and faded photographs pinned to their lapels. Some came with canes and wheelchairs. But all stood when the anthem played. Behind them, families, teachers, students from 3 nearby military academies. And children, so many children, clutching flags. Watching with wide eyes and no understanding of the quiet fire that lived in every adult's gaze. At the center of it all was a new black granite monument. Polished and regal, the inscription read, "In honor of those who wore the uniform and bore the burden, not just of war, but of injustice. Let us remember, and let us rise." Walter stepped up to the microphone. For a long moment, he said nothing, just let the wind speak. Let the flags flutter, let the ghosts settle. Then, softly, "My father used to say, dying in service is not the worst thing that can happen to a soldier. Being erased is worse." He paused. Today, we remember not just General Walter Davis Sr., but every name that was never given a statue. Every salute that was ignored. Every coffin buried without ceremony just because the skin beneath the uniform was the wrong color. There was silence, the kind that listens. Some wounds, he continued, don't bleed, they're quiet, they move through generations. But today, on this soil, with these hands, we say, no more silence. Applause rose, not loud, but powerful, the kind that vibrated through the chest more than the ears. Blank. Underscore. Blank. Later that week, a ribbon was cut. The sign was new, shining, permanent. The Walter Davis Senior Leadership Academy. Built on the site of an old segregated training facility. The academy was now the first military preparatory school in the state to be named after a black general. The hallways smelled of new paint. The walls held framed quotes about honor, unity, and service. But the soul of the school lived in the students, boys and girls of every race and background. Learning not just tactics or history, but ethics, humanity. Every first-year cadet took a class called Command and Conscience. Its first lesson began with a clip from that now famous funeral, Milton raising the gun. Davis Jr. holding steady. Then the instructor would ask, "What does it mean to command? When others are afraid of who you are?" And then, the real discussions began. Blank. Underscore. Blank. Meanwhile, in Washington, something rare happened: agreement. On the heels of public outcry, military pressure, and a bipartisan lobbying effort led by the National Veterans of Color Coalition, Congress passed a sweeping new piece of legislation. Officially, it was titled the Federal Integrity and Enforcement Act, 2032, but no one called it that. Across the country, it was known as the Milton Law. The law banned the use of race as a factor in suspect profiling by law enforcement during official duties. Under threat of federal prosecution, it mandated mandatory bias training, required body cam usage on all federal officers, and, perhaps most importantly, created a civilian-led oversight council with the power to review cases and issue public findings. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't complete, but it was real, and for families who had long lived in fear, it felt like the first door opening. Blank. Blank. Then came the movie. A national broadcaster partnered with a black veteran-led production company. They called it The Funeral. It premiered on every major platform. A-list actors played the roles. A stirring score carried scenes of flashbacks, courtroom tension, and that final walk down the marble courthouse stairs. But the scene everyone talked about, everyone remembered, was the silence. That moment when the gun was raised. When the crowd gasped. When a general, unarmed and grieving, looked into the eyes of a man aiming to erase him, and did not flinch. Classrooms screened it. Churches held community dialogues around it. Even a few police academies quietly made it part of their ethics modules. Blank. And so, the wound began to heal. Not vanish but breathe. There were still protests. There were still outrages. America did not become perfect overnight. But people began to remember names they had never been taught. They began to say, that was wrong. And more importantly, that could have been us. Blank. On the anniversary evening, Walter Davis Jr. returned alone to his father's grave. No cameras, no speeches. He knelt, ran his fingers along the lettering. General Walter Davis Sr., 1928 to 2031. A soldier, a father, a legacy. The sky above was quiet, painted in strokes of orange and violet. A breeze moved through the trees, as if clearing its throat. Walter leaned forward, resting his palm gently on the cold stone. "Dad," he said, "we did it, not for revenge, not even for justice." He exhaled. "We did it because people needed to see what dignity looks like. What holding the line really means. Not on the battlefield, but in moments when no one's sure what side they're on." He stood, straightened his coat. "But we're not done yet. There's still one war left." He glanced at the horizon. The war for dignity, for humanity, for decency. He touched the stone one last time. "And I promise you, on my honor, we're not going to lose this one." And with that, Walter Davis Jr., son of a buried general, turned and walked away, not in mourning, not in rage, but with resolve, because legacies don't live in gravestones. They live in the people who choose to remember. And in a country learning, slowly, painfully, how to be better than its worst day. If this story moved you, if it made you pause and think, share it. Let the world remember that dignity has no color. And justice begins when silence ends. Thank you for watching.